Why, hi there. I'm Miss Barbara from the Huntington Beach Library. I am here for a Mrs PIggle Wiggle Treasury reading by Betty McDonald. And today we're going to be reading some of the stories from the book Mrs PIggle Wiggle's Magic. Mrs PIggle Wiggle is a cross between Nanny McPhee and Mary Poppins, and she is magical and has very magical cures to help cure common childhood ailments. So today we're going to be reading about the interrupters. Find out what sort of magical cure Mrs PIggle Wiggle has for that. All right, The Interrupters by Betty McDonald. What do you suppose happened at the garden club today? Mrs. Franklin asked her husband at dinner. But before Mr. Franklin could answer, Benji Franklin said, "Hey, Dad, I'm pitcher of our team."
"Please don't interrupt, Benjamin," Mr. Franklin said. "Now what happened at your garden club, Carol?"
"Well, John, I won first prize for my arrangement of driftwood and seed pods," Mrs. Franklin said.
"The thing I don't understand about flower arrangements,"
Mr. Franklin began when Stevie interrupted to say, "I caught a little green frog on my way home from school." "Don't interrupt Daddy," Mrs. Franklin said. "Now what is it you don't understand about flower arrangements, John?"
"What I don't understand is why you don't use flowers. Why do you always have to use—"
And then Sally Franklin interrupted. She said, "I need a new pair of roller skates. My roller skates are so slow, I'm ashamed of them, and I need—" "Yeah, well, you have roller skates last spring, and I need a new baseball," Benji began, when Stevie interrupted to say, "This is a little frog. He was just sitting there," and Benji interrupted him and said, "I can't pitch with this old ball." And Sally said, "Everyone in our block has new roller skates, and as the child interrupted each other, the talk became louder and louder and louder until all of them were shouting. Do you interrupt at home? Mr. Franklin shouted louder than anyone.
"Be quiet, all of you! I desire to finish my thought. Now, the thing I don't understand about flower arrangements is why you just don't use flowers. Why do you always have to use sticks or old weeds or seed pods or broken flower pots with the flowers?"
Mrs. Franklin smiled at her husband and began explaining. "Flower arranging is an art," when Sally interrupted again. "If I try to make figure eights with a broken strap with my roller skates, I'll probably kill myself." And Stevie interrupted her by saying, "Hey, would you like to see my little green frog I've got?" And then Benji interrupted him, saying,
"Doesn't anyone in this family care that I'm captain of my baseball team? Doesn't anyone—" "Stop interrupting!" Mr. Franklin shouted.
There was quiet for a minute. Mrs. Franklin began again. "All right, dear. Flower arranging is an art." And then she was interrupted by a loud scream from Sally. "Mother! Daddy! Stevie has a frog in his pocket! I heard it! He's got a frog in his pocket!" "Stevie, do you have a frog in your pocket?" asked Mrs. Franklin. "Well, yeah, I just happened to," Stevie said, reaching out and bringing out a very small green frog. "Oh," Sally said, "he brought it in the house."
"Hey, let me see it," Benji said. "Boy, is he nifty. How'd you catch him?"
"It wasn't hard," Stevie said. "I was just walking around, and there he was, and I heard him."
"Take the frog outside," Mr. Franklin said sternly.
"Oh, Daddy, not outside," Stevie said. "He'll get away."
"Outside," Mr. Franklin repeated.
Stevie started slowly to his feet, carefully holding the frog between his cupped hands. And when he got to the kitchen door, he turned to his mother. "Say, Mother, this frog would be just about right in your flower arrangements." "Oh, Stevie, what a wonderful idea," Mrs. Franklin said. "But how would I get him to stay in a bowl?" "Oh, cheaper stay," said Stevie. "He's awfully tame. He does just about anything I want him to."
"If he's so tame, then what does he need you to put him outside and what to tell him to do and wait there for you?" said Mr. Franklin. "If he's tame, just say, 'Stay outside.'"
And Benji said, "Aw, gee, Daddy, can't we put him in the basement? He'll get lost outside." And Mr. Franklin said,
"All right, put him in the basement, but put him in a box or something. Now, Carol, dear, what was this you were telling me about flower arranging?"
Actually, I think the frog would be better off outside, but that's just me. Mrs. Franklin smiled and began, I said flower arranging is an art and that, hey, Dad, is this box all right? Stevie called from the kitchen where he was standing on a high stool rummaging around the shelf. And Mr. Franklin said, don't interrupt, your mother is talking. And Mrs. Franklin began again. Flower arranging is, and Stevie came into the dining room, poked his father's arm and whispered in a very loud whisper, is this box all right, Daddy? And Mr. Franklin put his hands up to his head and said, I'm going crazy. Interrupt, interrupt, interrupt. That's all these children do. We haven't finished a sentence in this house for weeks. Now, Stevie, you stand over here and wait until your mother finishes explaining about flower arranging is an art. And Stevie did, although it took Mrs. Franklin almost 15 minutes. It was very uninteresting to him, and his frog kept chirping loudly. The very second Mrs. Franklin finished her reasoning as how to do flower arranging, Stevie said, hey, Dad, is this box all right?
Why, yes. Go ahead, said Mr. Franklin. Go put the frog in it. Carol, do you suppose that Mrs. Piggle Wiggle knows a cure for interrupting?
Hopefully she does. Well, I wouldn't be surprised, said Mrs. Franklin. I'll call, and Miss Sally interrupted, you know, if I only had new roller skates, I could do a double figure. Hey, what do frogs eat? Benji called from the basement. And I could do backwards after 8, and I could do all sorts of things with new skates, Sally interrupted again. Hey, are flies all right? Stevie called, and Sally said, I could help with the dishes every night if I could get money for new roller skates. Hey, could I feed my frog dead flies? Called Stevie. And to pay for them it wouldn't, Sally began, and Benji yelled, hey, Stevie has a box full of half-dead old flies. Would that kill the little frog? Hey, Mom, Stevie's dumping flies all over the basement stairs.
Call Mrs. Piggle Wiggle right now,
said Mr. Franklin. I think he's getting tired of all the interrupting. I hope none of you are interrupters, because you know, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle has a cure for that. So Mrs. Franklin did. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said, oh, yes, I have some wonderful magic interrupter powder. It comes with 2 little blowers, and I would suggest that you and Mr. Franklin each use one. At the dinner table, when you start to talk, have Mr. Franklin blow the powder on the children. When he talks, you blow the powder on the children. There'll be no interrupting, I guarantee it. Why don't you send Benji and Stevie over for it now while it's still light outside? Mrs. Franklin would, and thanked Mrs. Piggle Wiggle and hung up. Benji and Stevie were glad to go because they loved Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, and anyway they wanted to show her their new tree frog cheaper. And when they were gone, Mr. Franklin and Mrs. Franklin washed the dishes, and Mr. Franklin smoked his pipe and read the paper. When the boys came home, they gave the package to their mother, and they went right to the basement to fix their frog because Mrs. Frog, okay, here they are. They're getting that magic interrupting powder from Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. And let's find out what it does. All right, when the boys came home, they gave their package to the mother and went right down to the basement to fix their frog because Mrs. Piggle Wiggle had given them a box of frog food, and they were anxious to see if Chipper would eat it. They asked Sally to come to the basement with them, but she had a mat to draw and went to her room. When they were alone, Mr. and Mrs. Franklin opened up Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's package. It contained a little can of white powder and 2 blowers. The directions on the can said, interrupter powder. Place a small amount of the powder in a bowl of the blower, and when you wish to stop an interrupter, blow a little of the powder in his face. The powder cannot be seen or felt, but it is wise to blow it when the interrupter is not looking. Mr. and Mrs. Franklin were anxious to try this magic powder, but they knew it would be wiser to wait until breakfast the next time in the morning. So they sent the children to bed early and spent the rest of the evening in blissful, uninterrupted quiet. Just before they went to bed, they filled their little magic blowers and put them on the table in the upper hall where they wouldn't forget them. The next morning, they could hardly wait for the children to come to breakfast and begin interrupting, because that's all the children ever did was interrupt. When at last they had all assembled,
On purpose, Mr. Franklin began a long, dull story about the value of getting up early. Before the children had a chance to see how long and dull the story was going to be, and while they were all turned towards Mr. Franklin, Mrs. Franklin took out her little blower and blew the magic powder on them. And then Mr. Franklin began. When I was a little boy, I loved to get up early. No one ever had any trouble getting me out of bed. I used to get up early every morning. At first, I'd get up a little bit late, like about 6:30. Then I started getting up at 5:30, and I decided that wasn't early enough, so I began getting up at 4:30. And Benji then decided to interrupt. There's a boy at school, he began, but that's as far as he got. His mouth open and closed like a goldfish, but no sound came out. Mr. Franklin looked at him and smiled and continued. At 4:30 I could see the beauty of the sunrise and hear the early morning sounds. Stevie tried to interrupt. My teacher says, but that's as far as he got. His mouth snapped open and snapped closed, and snapped open and snapped closed, like a spectacle case, but no sound came out. Sally began to laugh and to point at the boys. Hey, look, she began, but her mouth just stayed open. Wide. She looked like a board with a knothole in it. Mr. Franklin looked around at her gasping children, smiled with pleasure, and continued. Sounds of the bird song and peace. The smell of delicious fragrance of the flowers drenched the dew. I could watch the sun come up and give the gray earth form and color. He finished his story in uninterrupted silence. Then Mrs. Franklin began. John, do you think I should have the Weavers to dinner on Friday night? They're terrible bores, but we do owe them a... Benji tried to interrupt. He said, today is... But no one ever found out what today was because his mouth just stayed open like Sally's. Mrs. Franklin continued. We do owe them a dinner, and the Calmers are not too. And Sally tried to say something. You told me... The sound stopped, but her mouth snapped open, and then shut, and then snapped open, and then shut, like a goldfish. Stevie said, well, what's the matter? But the words seemed to choke in his throat, and his mouth opened and shut, like a spectacle case. Mrs. Franklin continued, well, the Calmers are not too bright themselves, so really would be killing two birds with one stone, and we owe them a dinner too, so we should have both of them over at the same time. Which is a fine way to talk about your cooking, said Mr. Franklin, laughing. The children didn't say anything. They just sat there like a knothole, a fish in a spectacle case. That afternoon, Mrs. Franklin had some of the ladies from her garden club over for tea. She asked Sally to pass the sandwiches and the boys to keep the kettle boiling and to wash the teacups. Sally on her best ruffly white pinafore, and the boys washed and cleared the watermarks of their wrists and made sure everything went smoothly until Mrs. Wintersmelt began explaining the value of chicken wire in the flower arrangements. All the ladies were listening most eagerly when suddenly the kitchen door flung open and Benji and Stevie came racing into the living room. Isn't it watercress, Mother? Stevie asked. Oh, listen to that dummy, Benji said. Anybody knows it's water, crackle. Boys, said Mrs. Franklin, go to the kitchen. You have interrupted Mrs. Wintersmill. And the boys sheepishly back into the kitchen, and Mrs. Franklin excused herself. Guess what she's going to do. Picked up her little blower from down the hall and followed them inside. Just as they turned the corner from the pantry to the kitchen, she covered them with the magic powder and gave them a short, firm lecture that it is not polite to interrupt guests in the middle of their talking. I hope you all know that's not polite, because it's not. Then, just for safety's sake, she called to Sally, who was listening outside the door anyway, hoping the boys might be slapped a little, and told her to fix some more lemon slices. When she was getting the lemon out of the cooler and had her back turned, guess what Mrs. Franklin does? Yeah, I think we're going to know what she's going to do. She sprayed her with the magic powder and then went back to the living room to catch the end of Miss Wintersmelt's advice on chicken wire.
When Mrs. Wintersmell had acknowledged the clapping that followed her talk, Mrs. Backscratcher began to talk on how much more effective flower arrangements are when you don't use flowers at all. She was well into her subject and was describing the lovely flower arrangement she had brought with her that she had made with her maple toothpicks and bottle caps when Sally tried to interrupt her to tell her that they made things out of toothpicks at school. She took hold of Mrs. Backscratcher's arm and began, "We make," but that was as far as she got. Her mouth just stayed open. Mrs. Backscratcher stopped talking and stared at her. "Does the child stammer?" she asked. No," Mrs. Franklin said in the most exasperated way. "She interrupts, which is worse. Go to the kitchen, Sally." Sally, with her mouth still wide open, went. Mrs. Backscratcher continued, "You know, ladies, that's a very funny thing. That little girl's open mouth reminds me of a lovely arrangement I saw in Chicago, made out of a knothole and a bunch of grass." The ladies all moved closer. Mrs. Franklin, from the corner of her eye, saw the kitchen. All right, what does she see? She saw the kitchen door swing open. Benji and Stevie edged into the hall and began, "Mom, Stevie, Mom, Benji." That's all. They just stood there with their mouths opening and closing, with no sound coming up. The ladies all stopped listening to Mrs. Backscratcher and looked at the children. Mrs. Wartmonger, who was deaf and wore an earphone, thought the children were saying something, so she turned her earphone up as high as it would go, and when she couldn't hear anything, she took out the batteries and tapped them again. Mrs. Franklin got up and pushed the boys back into the kitchen. Mrs. Backscratcher continued, 2 pipe cleaners and a vanilla cork put in the middle of a sardine can." Only to Mrs. Wartmonger came out to, 2 pipe cleaners and a vanilla cork put into an empty sardine can," until she turned down her hearing aid. For the rest of the afternoon, the children stayed in the kitchen. But just to be on the safe side, Mrs. Franklin kept a little blower in her knitting bag. At dinner, Mr. Franklin blew so much magic powder on the children that they didn't even start to interrupt. Just turned their heads towards the person they hoped to interrupt, opened and closed their mouths, or kept their mouths open or snapped open and snapped shut like a spectacle case. Finally, Sally, during a pause in the conversation, and when she was not interrupting, asked her mother and Daddy what made Benji and Stevie and her suddenly stop talking and look like fish. So Mr. and Mrs. Franklin told her all about the magic interrupter power and showed the children the little blowers. Benji said, "I think that's a good idea, but I think you and Daddy should have some too. You interrupt a lot of times too." And Mr. Franklin said, "Benji, your mother and I are grown-ups." And Mrs. Franklin said, "I think Benjamin is right." And she blew a big puff of powder on Mr. Franklin. And he grabbed his blower and blew some on her. And then everybody laughed. A few minutes later, Mr. Franklin tried to interrupt Mrs. Franklin's rather long, drawn-out description of her tea, and he certainly was surprised to have his mouth open and shut and stay open and have no sound come out. And then Mrs. Franklin tried to interrupt Benji's night before last night's dream, which turned out to be a rehash of Treasure Island. Her mouth stayed open and shut, just like a fish. The children and Mr. Franklin laughed. Of course, the Franklins used up all the magic powder in 2 weeks, but its spell lasted, and to this day, nobody in that family ever interrupts anybody else. It is just a pleasure to tell a story at the Franklin house. You can always count on being uninterrupted with eager attention, even if you are the biggest bore in the world. They did learn their lessons. There's no more interrupting, and they always pay attention to what you have to say. That's from the Mrs. PIggle Wiggle Treasury. Until next time, this is Miss Barbara signing off. Stay happy, stay healthy, stay safe, and most of all, keep on reading.